Sometimes the quietest sentence becomes the loudest turning point in a person's life. No one inside the Grand Regency Ballroom expected those words to open the most anticipated acceptance speech of the year. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors. Television cameras slowly swept over rows of elegantly dressed executives, investors, governors, philanthropists, and business leaders who had gathered from every corner of America to celebrate the recipient of the Business Leader of the Year award. Every conversation faded into silence as Victoria Sterling, the 37-year-old billionaire CEO of Sterling Dynamics, stepped toward the microphone without unfolding the carefully prepared speech resting in her hand. She stood perfectly still for several long seconds, her calm blue eyes scanning the crowd as though she were searching for someone only she could see. The room waited. Reporters lowered their pens. Camera shutters stopped clicking. Even the orchestra quietly rested their instruments. Victoria smiled, but it was not the polished smile that had appeared on countless magazine covers over the past decade. It was smaller, softer, almost grateful. "People keep asking me what changed my company," she began, her voice steady enough to fill every corner of the magnificent ballroom. "They ask about strategy, leadership, investments, and innovation. They're all looking for some brilliant business secret." A few people chuckled politely. Victoria gently shook her head. "They're asking the wrong question." Curious whispers moved through the audience before disappearing again. "The real question is this," she continued. "Who changed me?" Every face remained fixed on the stage. It wasn't another billionaire. It wasn't a senator. It wasn't an economist. It wasn't someone with influence or power. She paused once more, allowing every word to settle naturally. It was a single father from a tiny repair shop in Montana. The silence became almost tangible. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. One television producer quietly gestured for every camera to stay focused on Victoria. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. She looked toward the back of the ballroom, where a modest man in a navy suit sat beside a smiling little girl whose feet barely reached the floor from her chair. Ethan Brooks looked exactly as uncomfortable with public attention as he had always been, gently straightening his daughter's sleeve while pretending hundreds of eyes were not turning toward them. Lily Brooks smiled up at her father as though nothing about the evening felt unusual. Victoria's expression softened even further. "Most people believe extraordinary people change history through extraordinary actions," she said. "I believe that too. I spent my entire career chasing bigger numbers, taller buildings, faster growth, and louder applause. I thought success meant never slowing down." She glanced briefly toward the glittering trophy resting beside the podium before looking back at Ethan. Then one ordinary afternoon, on a quiet highway in Montana, a man covered in engine grease whispered one simple sentence that completely changed the direction of my life. The audience leaned forward almost together. No one spoke. No one moved. Victoria slowly folded her prepared speech without reading a single word from it. "Tonight isn't about this award," she said gently. "Tonight is about the day I discovered what success actually means." She took one slow breath as the lights above the ballroom seemed warmer than before, and somewhere beyond the towering windows of Manhattan, memories carried her back to an empty Montana highway where everything had begun. 2 months earlier, the mountains of western Montana stretched beneath a wide September sky, painted with soft shades of blue and gold as Highway 83 wound peacefully between towering pine forests and sparkling lakes that reflected the afternoon sunlight like polished glass. Victoria Sterling rarely noticed scenery anymore. For years her world had been measured by departure times, quarterly reports, conference calls, private flights, and carefully managed calendars that left almost no room for unexpected moments. She had accepted an invitation to visit a renewable energy project outside Missoula, and every minute of her schedule had already been planned by 3 different assistants. Her luxury sedan moved steadily along the quiet highway until a small warning light suddenly appeared on the dashboard. She glanced at it with mild annoyance before returning her attention to the road, assuming the onboard computer would correct whatever minor issue had appeared. Instead, Another warning light illuminated beside the first. Within seconds, the engine began losing power. The smooth hum disappeared, replaced by an uneven vibration that grew stronger with every passing mile. Victoria carefully guided the car onto the gravel shoulder as the engine finally became silent. She pressed the ignition button again. Nothing happened except a soft clicking sound. She tried once more with the same result. Looking through the windshield, she realized there were no buildings, no gas stations, and almost no traffic in either direction. Her phone displayed only a weak signal that disappeared before she could complete a call. She leaned back in the driver's seat and quietly exhaled. For perhaps the first time in many years, there was no assistant to solve the problem, no chauffeur waiting nearby, and no executive team standing ready with immediate solutions. Only silence surrounded her. Nearly 15 minutes passed before an aging blue pickup truck appeared around the bend, towing a small utility trailer filled with neatly organized tools and automotive equipment. The truck slowed without hesitation before pulling safely onto the shoulder several yards ahead of her vehicle. A tall man stepped out wearing faded blue jeans, worn brown work boots, and a weathered denim work shirt with the sleeves rolled above his forearms. His short brown hair carried traces of engine dust, and light stubble framed a face that looked more familiar with hard work than with luxury. He walked toward the stranded sedan with an easy, unhurried confidence and offered a warm smile that expected nothing in return. "Looks like you could use a hand," he said kindly. Victoria lowered the window only halfway, still uncertain how much trust to place in a stranger on an empty highway. "I think the engine stopped," she answered. "It certainly did," he replied after, listening carefully for a moment as she attempted to start again. "Do not worry. Let me take a quick look." There was no trace of curiosity about who she was, no recognition, no attempt to impress her. He simply opened the hood with practiced hands and quietly examined the engine compartment while the afternoon breeze carried the scent of pine trees across the road. After several thoughtful minutes, he closed the hood gently. "This is not something we can fix out here," he explained with complete honesty. "My garage is about 12 miles from here. I can tow your car if you're comfortable with that." Victoria studied him carefully. His truck was old but exceptionally clean. Every tool rested exactly where it belonged. Even the trailer showed signs of careful maintenance. She realized she trusted him long before she understood why. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Ethan Brooks nodded with the same calm smile. "You are welcome. We should get moving, though. My daughter gets out of school soon, and she never lets me be late." The tow truck rolled slowly through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge before turning into a modest garage with a hand-painted wooden sign that simply read Brooks Auto Repair. It was nothing like the polished service centers Victoria usually visited. The building was weathered by years of Montana winters. Flower boxes rested beneath the front windows, and colorful children's drawings decorated the glass door leading into the small office. As Ethan carefully positioned her sedan inside the service bay, Victoria stepped out and looked around with quiet curiosity. The air carried the familiar scent of fresh pine, warm engine oil, and clean mountain air. Everything appeared simple, but nothing felt neglected. Every wrench hung in perfect order. Every shelf was clean. Every tool had its place. Ethan noticed her observing the garage and smiled. "It is not fancy," he said while rolling his toolbox beside the vehicle, "but it takes good care of the people who trust it." Before Victoria could answer, the cheerful sound of a bicycle bell echoed from outside. A little girl wearing a bright blue backpack coasted into the parking lot, jumped off her bicycle, and ran toward Ethan with effortless excitement. "Dad!" Lily Brooks called as she wrapped her arms around him. Ethan laughed warmly, set down the wrench in his hand, and hugged her back without the slightest concern that grease covered his work shirt. "How was school?" he asked. "I got 100% on my science quiz," Lily announced proudly. "I knew you would," Ethan replied with genuine confidence. "You worked hard for it." Lily noticed Victoria standing nearby and offered a friendly smile that carried none of the hesitation adults often showed toward strangers. "Hello," she said politely. "Welcome to our garage." Victoria returned the smile almost automatically. "Thank you." Ethan introduced them with natural ease. Lily, this is Miss Sterling. Her car decided it wanted a vacation. Lily giggled. Cars do that sometimes. Dad always says they get tired before people do. Victoria laughed softly, surprising herself. It had been a long time since laughter arrived without calculation. Ethan lifted the hood once again and began diagnosing the problem while Lily quietly completed her homework at a small wooden desk inside the office. Every few minutes, Ethan paused to answer one of her questions about fractions or spelling before returning to the engine without showing the slightest impatience. He never sounded rushed. He never made Lily feel like an interruption. To him, repairing an engine and helping his daughter solve a math problem seemed equally important. Victoria watched the quiet rhythm unfold before her. Customers arrived throughout the afternoon, each greeted by name. An elderly rancher dropped off homemade cookies as thanks for a repair completed the previous week. A young couple stopped only to wave hello. A delivery driver refused to leave before asking whether Lily had won her soccer game. This tiny garage was more than a business. It was part of the heartbeat of the community. Ethan accepted every conversation with the same calm attention, never acting as though one person's time mattered more than another's. Victoria quietly checked her phone out of habit. Dozens of unread emails waited for immediate decisions. Several executives had already left urgent voice messages asking when she would return to New York. She looked back toward Ethan instead. He was kneeling beside the engine, carefully tightening a component before wiping his hands on a clean cloth. Lily looked up from her homework and smiled at him without saying a word. He smiled back just as naturally. In that silent exchange, Victoria witnessed something no board meeting, financial report, or billion-dollar acquisition had ever managed to create. It was not wealth. It was not influence. It was something quieter, steadier, and somehow far more valuable than either. By the time the afternoon sun settled lower behind the mountains, Ethan had finished replacing the damaged component, carefully tested the engine twice, and taken the sedan for a short drive along the quiet road outside the garage. When he returned, the engine purred with smooth confidence, sounding as though nothing had ever gone wrong. He parked beside the office and handed Victoria the keys with the same relaxed smile he had worn since they first met on the highway. "She's ready to go," he said. Victoria started the engine herself and listened for a moment before switching it off again. "That was faster than I expected," she admitted. Ethan shrugged lightly. Sometimes machines simply need someone to pay attention. He walked inside the office, printed the invoice, and placed it on the wooden counter. Victoria looked down at the total and blinked in surprise. The amount was far lower than she had anticipated. "This cannot be right," she said. "It is correct," Ethan answered. "Parts, labor, and the tow. That is everything." Victoria reached into her handbag and removed several crisp $100 bills before placing them beside the invoice. "Please accept this anyway," she said. "You saved my entire schedule today." Ethan glanced at the money without touching it. "You have already paid for the repair. This is a thank you." "I appreciate the thought," he replied gently, sliding the extra money back toward her, "but gratitude does not need to be measured by dollars." Victoria studied him, convinced he had misunderstood. "It would help your business." Ethan smiled again, patient but unwavering. "Maybe, but if I charge one person more than the work is worth because they can afford it, then someday I might charge another person less because they cannot. I would rather every customer know exactly what to expect when they walk through that door." His voice remained calm, free from judgment or pride. It was simply the way he believed life should work. Victoria found herself without an answer. In boardrooms across the country, she negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet a mechanic in a small Montana town had quietly ended the conversation with a single principle that needed no presentation and no negotiation. Just then, Lily walked into the office carrying a small paper bag folded neatly at the top. "Dad," she whispered, "can I give Miss Sterling one of the apple muffins we baked this morning?" Ethan smiled. "Only if you were planning to share it anyway." Lily nodded eagerly before offering the bag to Victoria with both hands. "Road trips are better when you have a snack," she said. Victoria accepted it almost cautiously, as though the simple gift carried more weight than she understood. "Thank you, Lily. That is very kind." "You are welcome," Lily replied with complete sincerity. "Dad says people remember kindness longer than they remember favors." Ethan laughed softly. "I might have said something like that." Victoria looked from the little girl to her father. There was no performance here. No carefully crafted image. No hidden agenda. Everything they said seemed to come from habits built over years of living the same values every day. She placed the paper bag carefully on the passenger seat instead of inside her briefcase, almost instinctively protecting it. Before climbing in her car, she turned back toward Ethan. "I hope I have a chance to repay you someday." Ethan leaned casually against the garage doorway as the late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the gravel parking lot. "If you really want to repay me," he said with a warm smile, "then the next time someone needs a little patience, give them a little more than they expect. That usually lasts longer than money." Victoria nodded slowly, carrying those words with her as she pulled onto the quiet Montana road. Believing the repair was the most valuable thing she had received that day, completely unaware that the moment capable of changing her life had not happened yet. Victoria drove away from Brooks Auto Repair with the windows slightly open, letting the cool Montana air replace the constant hum of conference calls that usually filled every mile of her travels. The paper bag containing Lily's apple muffin rested carefully on the passenger seat, instead of being tossed into the back with her briefcase. She smiled at herself for protecting a simple homemade snack as though it were something valuable. 10 miles passed peacefully before she reached a scenic overlook where the mountains stretched endlessly beneath the golden evening sky. Without thinking, she eased the sedan into the parking area and stepped outside. The silence was unlike anything she experienced in Manhattan. There were no sirens, no ringing phones, no impatient footsteps rushing through polished office corridors. Only a gentle breeze moved through the pine trees while sunlight painted the distant peaks with warm shades of amber. Victoria leaned against the railing overlooking the valley and realized she had not stood still without checking her phone in longer than she could remember. She reached into the paper bag, broke off a small piece of the apple muffin, and laughed softly after the first bite. It tasted homemade in the best possible way. Imperfect in appearance, yet filled with warmth that no luxury bakery could reproduce. As she stood there, she heard the familiar sound of an older pickup truck approaching behind her. Ethan pulled into the overlook, stepped out, and walked over with his usual calm expression. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. Victoria looked surprised. "Did something happen to the car?" Ethan smiled and gently shook his head. "No, I only realized after you left that I never checked whether everything still felt right once the engine warmed up. Sometimes the best test happens after a few miles." Victoria looked at him for a long moment before quietly saying, "You drove all this way just to make sure a customer was all right." "I drove this way because I was heading home," Ethan answered. "Checking on you only added a few minutes." Together, they listened as the engine idled smoothly. Ethan nodded with quiet satisfaction before closing the hood once again. "She sounds exactly the way she should." Victoria thanked him once more, but this time the words carried more meaning. "I still feel like I owe you something." Ethan looked toward the mountains instead of toward her. The evening sunlight rested gently across the valley, and for several seconds neither of them spoke. Then he turned back with the same quiet kindness she had seen all afternoon. His voice became softer, almost as though the mountains themselves deserved to hear the words first. "May I tell you one thing before you leave?" Victoria nodded. Ethan stepped no closer than necessary and spoke with complete sincerity. "Do not spend your whole life becoming someone the world admires if you forget to remain someone your own heart can recognize." The sentence was neither dramatic nor loud. It arrived almost like the evening breeze passing through the trees. Yet something inside Victoria became perfectly still. She searched for an answer, but discovered that none of the thousands of speeches she had given, none of the leadership books she had read, and none of the business advice she had collected over the years could stand beside those simple words. Ethan smiled gently, unaware of the weight his sentence had just placed upon her heart. "Drive safely," he said before climbing back into his pickup. Victoria remained beside the overlook long after the truck disappeared around the bend. The mountains had not changed. The road had not changed. Even the sky looked exactly as it had a few minutes earlier. Yet somehow, without warning and without ceremony, the direction of her life had begun to change forever. Victoria returned to New York before sunrise the following morning, and by 8 o'clock, she was seated at the head of the longest conference table inside Sterling Dynamics headquarters overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The familiar routine unfolded exactly as it always had. Financial forecasts filled enormous presentation screens. Executives discussed acquisitions, expansion plans, shareholder expectations, and quarterly performance with polished confidence. Normally, Victoria would have guided every conversation without hesitation, but this morning something felt different. As one vice president suggested reducing employee development programs to improve short-term margins, Victoria found her thoughts drifting back to a quiet garage in Montana, where a father had paused in the middle of repairing an engine simply to help his daughter with her homework. She looked around the boardroom and realized that everyone was speaking about numbers while no one was speaking about people. The observation settled quietly in her heart. "What happens to the employees affected by this proposal?" she asked. The room became noticeably still. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances because that question rarely appeared before discussions about profitability. One director quickly replied that the reductions would be efficient and financially responsible. Victoria listened without interrupting before calmly asking another question. Efficient for whom? No one answered immediately. The meeting continued, yet its rhythm had changed. Instead of approving every recommendation based solely on financial projections, Victoria began asking about families, communities, training opportunities, and long-term trust. Her question surprised even her closest advisors. After the meeting, Margaret Collins, her longtime chief operating officer, followed Victoria into the executive office carrying a tablet filled with revised schedules. "You seem distracted this morning," Margaret observed carefully. Victoria walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city below. Thousands of people hurried along the sidewalks without noticing one another, each carrying responsibilities invisible to everyone else. "I do not think I was distracted," Victoria answered quietly. "I think I finally started paying attention." Margaret smiled politely, but remained puzzled. "Did something happen during your trip to Montana?" Victoria hesitated before opening the small paper bag. She had carried all the way back from Cedar Ridge. Inside rested the last piece of Lily's apple muffin, carefully wrapped in a napkin. Margaret looked at it with gentle confusion. "You brought that home?" Victoria nodded with an almost embarrassed smile. "I could have eaten it yesterday. Instead, I wanted to remember how it felt to receive something given without expecting anything back." Margaret had worked beside Victoria for nearly 15 years. She had witnessed billion-dollar negotiations, international expansions, and impossible deadlines, but she had never seen her employer become emotional over a homemade muffin. Later that afternoon, Victoria quietly canceled a meeting that had been scheduled months in advance. Instead, she visited the employee cafeteria without photographers or executives accompanying her. She sat beside a young software engineer eating lunch alone and asked about his family. She thanked the maintenance staff individually as they polished the lobby floors. She stayed late to write handwritten notes, recognizing employees whose quiet contributions rarely appeared in company reports. The changes were small, almost invisible to the outside world, yet each decision seemed to grow naturally from the sentence that still echoed gently in her mind. That evening, after the building had nearly emptied, Victoria stood once more beside the office windows watching the lights of Manhattan stretch toward the horizon. Success had always looked magnificent from this height, yet for the first time, she understood that admiration from strangers could never replace respect from her own heart. Somewhere beneath the same evening sky, Ethan Brooks was probably closing his garage for the day and helping Lily finish another homework assignment, completely unaware that one quiet conversation beside a Montana highway had already begun transforming a company, a leader, and a life hundreds of miles away. The weeks that followed brought changes so gradual that most people inside Sterling Dynamics could not explain them, yet everyone could feel them. Meetings ended with more listening than speaking. Managers were encouraged to spend time with the people behind the numbers instead of only reviewing performance charts. Community investment projects that had once been considered secondary suddenly became meaningful priorities. When the executive committee proposed expanding into several rural regions across the western United States, Victoria quietly pointed to a map of Montana. "Let us begin here," she said. No one questioned the decision. Officially, the company described the initiative as a long-term infrastructure partnership designed to strengthen local economies. Unofficially, Victoria found herself looking forward to every flight that carried her back toward the mountains she could no longer forget. Each visit included meetings with town leaders, small business owners, teachers, and local organizations, but somehow the schedule always left an hour available near Brooks Auto Repair. Ethan never seemed surprised when she arrived. He greeted her with the same warm smile, whether she wore an expensive tailored suit or a simple jacket for traveling. He never treated her differently because of her title, and perhaps that was exactly why she kept returning. One afternoon, she stopped by the garage, carrying coffee for everyone inside. Lily hurried over with the excitement only a child could express. "You came back," she said happily. "Victoria left." "I suppose I did." Lily pointed toward the service bay, where Ethan was finishing work beneath the hood of an old ranch truck. "Dad said you were probably helping lots of people." Victoria glanced toward Ethan before answering. "I hope I'm learning how." Ethan wiped his hands on a clean shop towel and walked over. "How is New York treating you?" he asked. Victoria smiled thoughtfully. "It has not changed very much." Ethan tilted his head with quiet curiosity. "And you?" For a brief moment, she searched for the right words. "I think I have." Ethan nodded, as though that answer required no further explanation. They spent the afternoon talking about ordinary things instead of extraordinary achievements. Lily proudly showed Victoria a school art project featuring mountains, blue lakes, and a little garage with bright flower boxes beneath the windows. Ethan described a local fundraiser for the volunteer fire department. Victoria shared stories about employees who had received new opportunities because the company had invested in training instead of reducing costs. None of the conversations sounded dramatic, yet each one left her feeling lighter than another successful corporate presentation ever had. Before leaving, Victoria noticed several elderly neighbors waiting outside with vehicles scheduled for repair. Ethan greeted every customer by name, remembered details about their families, and patiently explained every repair without using complicated language. There was dignity in the way he served people, not because the work was glamorous, but because every person mattered. Watching him reminded Victoria that respect was never earned through position alone. It was built one quiet interaction at a time. As she drove away that evening, she realized her trips to Montana no longer felt like business travel. They felt like returning to a place where success had a different definition. Hundreds of miles away, investors continued measuring growth through financial reports, while here a father measured a good day by repaired engines, shared meals, honest conversations, and a daughter who smiled every time he walked through the front door. For the first time in many years, Victoria discovered she was no longer counting the days until her next meeting. She was quietly counting the days until she could return again. Autumn arrived quietly in Montana, painting the hills with shades of gold, crimson, and deep green as cool morning air drifted across the clear lake outside Cedar Ridge. Victoria had officially scheduled another visit to review the progress of Sterling Dynamics Community Partnership, yet every meaningful appointment on her calendar seemed to end a little earlier than expected. By late afternoon, she found herself standing beside Ethan and Lily at the edge of the wooden dock, where gentle ripples reflected the brilliant colors of the surrounding mountains. Lily knelt near the water, searching for perfectly smooth stones, while Ethan patiently demonstrated how to hold each one between two fingers before sending it dancing across the lake. "It is not about throwing harder," he said with an easy smile. "It is about letting the stone trust the water." Lily laughed after her fifth attempt skipped across the surface 4 times before disappearing beneath the calm water. Victoria tried next, but her stone splashed immediately. She shook her head and laughed at herself. Apparently, I've spent my entire life trying too hard. Ethan picked up another flat stone and handed it to her. Most people do, he replied gently, especially the successful ones. This time Victoria relaxed her grip, lowered her shoulder, and released the stone with less force. It skipped twice before sinking. She smiled as though she had accomplished something far greater than skipping a rock. The three of them sat together on the dock, sharing homemade sandwiches and warm coffee from a well-used thermos, while an eagle circled silently overhead. The conversation drifted naturally from school projects to favorite books, from mountain winters to childhood memories, and for several wonderful hours no one mentioned stock prices, board meetings, or business awards. As the afternoon sunlight softened, Lily wandered a short distance away to collect colorful leaves, leaving Ethan and Victoria alone with the peaceful sound of water touching the shoreline. Victoria looked across the lake before quietly speaking. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." She folded her hands together as though searching for words she had never spoken aloud before. "For years I believed success meant reaching the next goal before anyone else. Every accomplishment only made me chase another one. I kept climbing because everyone expected me to keep climbing." She paused before smiling sadly. "Some days I cannot remember why I started." Ethan remained silent long enough for the breeze to carry a few fallen leaves across the dock. Then he looked toward the mountains instead of toward her. "When I was younger," he said softly, "I thought happiness would arrive after I earned enough money, fixed enough problems, or proved myself to enough people. Life has a gentle way of teaching us that those finish lines keep moving." Victoria listened without interrupting. Ethan picked up another stone and turned it slowly in his hand. "Sometimes we spend years climbing a ladder before realizing it has been leaning against the wrong wall." The words settled into the quiet afternoon with the same calm certainty as the sentence he had whispered weeks earlier. Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness but from recognition. She finally understood that she had spent years building a remarkable life while quietly neglecting the person living inside it. Lily came running back with a handful of brilliant autumn leaves, proudly presenting each one as though it were a priceless treasure. Victoria accepted them with genuine delight, smiling more freely than she had in years. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, she realized that nothing extraordinary had happened that day. No headlines would ever describe a quiet afternoon beside a Montana lake. Yet, deep within her heart, she knew she had reached the most important decision of her life. She no longer wanted to build a future measured only by admiration. She wanted to build one she could peacefully recognize when she looked back upon it many years from now. The memory dissolved, and the warm lights of the Grand Regency Ballroom welcomed Victoria back to the present. Every face remained turned toward the stage, waiting for the ending of the story that had quietly drawn an entire room into complete silence. She looked toward the back of the ballroom, where Ethan Brooks sat beside Lily exactly as she had remembered from the beginning of her speech. Neither of them appeared comfortable being the center of attention. Ethan wore the same calm expression he carried in his small Montana garage, and Lily smiled proudly, without fully understanding why so many people kept looking in their direction. Victoria stepped away from the podium and spoke with gentle sincerity. "Ethan, would you and Lily please join me?" A quiet murmur moved through the audience as father and daughter slowly walked toward the stage. Ethan looked as though he would have preferred to remain unnoticed, but he accepted the invitation with quiet dignity. When they reached the stage, Victoria turned toward him with grateful eyes. "You probably do not remember saying it," she said softly, "because it was only one sentence on an ordinary evening beside a Montana highway." Ethan smiled modestly. "I remember the conversation. Victoria Nadif. Would you say it one more time?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment before looking out across the ballroom, filled with people who had spent their lives pursuing achievement, influence, and recognition. Then, In the same calm voice that had once carried across a peaceful mountain overlook, he said, "Do not spend your whole life becoming someone the world admires if you forget to remain someone your own heart can recognize." There was no dramatic music. There was no applause. For several unforgettable seconds, the magnificent ballroom became completely silent. Executives lowered their eyes. Investors sat motionless. Reporters who had planned to capture another routine acceptance speech quietly placed their pens on their notebooks. The sentence needed no explanation because everyone understood it differently, yet personally. Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked across the audience. "That sentence changed the way I lead my company," she said. "It changed the way I measure success. It changed the way I see people. Most importantly, it changed the way I see myself." She turned toward Ethan and Lily with a grateful smile. Awards recognize accomplishments, but character changes lives. Everything meaningful that has happened to me since that afternoon began with the kindness of a father who expected nothing in return and the generosity of a little girl who shared a homemade apple muffin with a stranger. The audience slowly rose to its feet, not because anyone had asked them to, but because respect had quietly replaced admiration. The applause that followed felt different from every standing ovation Victoria had ever received. It celebrated humility instead of power, kindness instead of status, and quiet dignity instead of public recognition. Ethan accepted the applause with the same modest smile he wore while repairing old pickup trucks in Cedar Ridge, never pretending he had accomplished anything extraordinary. To him, he had simply helped someone whose car had broken down. As the evening came to an end, the three of them stepped outside beneath the glowing lights of Manhattan. The towering buildings behind them represented everything Victoria had spent years chasing, while the ordinary sidewalk ahead, somehow, felt far more important. Lily slipped her hand into her father's. Victoria walked beside them without photographers or reporters, and together they disappeared into the quiet evening, leaving behind a room filled with people who would remember that true greatness rarely announces itself with noise. More often, it arrives as a whisper spoken by an ordinary person whose heart has never forgotten who they are.